Well, I'm honored to have been asked to join you this evening. And I'd like to beg.
Is your mic on, Doc?
Is my mic on?
Yeah, you're on. You're on. Just
Okay. A little closer? Yeah. I was about to apologize for the fact that this is Washington, D.C., hot, humid in the August, and it's taken away a little of my voice. But in any case, I'm honored to be here, and I had to come because this lady, who has done so much for our community, asked me to come. I must give a little ad. I just finished a book entitled Democratic Destiny and the District of Columbia. It was an edited book with Tony Michelle Travis of George Mason University. 10 outstanding chapters by young African-American scholars who are talking about the quality of democracy in the District of Columbia. And Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton has written an extremely substantive foreword. And I want to thank her for that, because she didn't have to do it. Let me say that as a graduate student, I was startled in the 1960s by a book that I ran across. I asked a question, and it was, who needs the Negro? Maybe some of you remember that book, but what it said to me was that the issue of needing the Negro had to do with the place of African Americans in the labor force, and that there was a consistent linkage between our presence in this country, indeed our original presence in this country, and the way in which we would be utilized as laborers, as one of the main reasons that really spread over all of the treatment of African Americans in every field one could name. Who needs a Negro? Well, I think that that question was asked also in the 1960s. Who needs a Negro? Because they were talking about the state of the black family. And the Congresswoman talked about the fact that in the late 1970s, 1960s, early 70s, that 70% of our community are single-headed households. Well, that's a little early, but the fact is that it did begin to manifest itself even then. Someone named Patrick Moynihan, later senator from the state of New York, wrote a book about the black family that caused a great deal of consternation because we were not ready to have the black family characterized by one failing yardstick. And yet that is, as a matter of fact, exactly what happened. What she also said was that even then we were experiencing the decline of our labor. When Who Needs a Negro was written, we were experiencing the decline of our presence in agricultural labor. When she talked about the 70% of females, we began to experience at a very early stage parts of the deindustrialization of this country began to manifest itself even there. So this issue of the linkage between black, particularly black males, and the viability of the economic system is where we are today. Algernon Austin of the Economic Policy Institute says that, in fact, when we look at our numbers, the numbers she cited, that we have been involved in a permanent recession. A permanent recession that is made even worse by the fact, and painful by the fact, that now with the current economic crisis, things are doubled. Things are doubled. So the question of who needs a Negro has to do with the state of our unemployment as one very viable indicator of where we are today. The Berkeley Labor Institute said something about the nature of our unemployment. And I'll read it. It said, officially unemployed, along with the discouraged and marginalized attached workers who have fallen out of the labor force, and those working part-time because they cannot find full-time work. By this measure, the situation in the black community is dire. The black underemployment rate went from 14.4% at the beginning of the recession and is now 23.6%. The underemployment rate, let me say, is a measure of the official unemployment rate plus. So the underemployment rate, 23.6%. In June of 2010, of 25%. Now, we have been fixed on the unemployment rate. But what are we fixed on is the underemployment rate. It's under consideration a far more comprehensive measure of who is looking for work. And the reason I say that is I was speaking in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, and the Detroit News challenged the official figures for unemployment in that city and said with respect to black males, it is 50%. 50%. Now that's probably generous. But when you look at a place like Washington, D.C., it's probably the same thing, 50%. So we ought to be real about the nature of what it is that we are facing today. President Obama just made a speech at the University of Texas, Austin, the other day, linking education to employment far more aggressively, and talked about the things that his administration has done. It would seem to me that there ought to be, and Representative Norton has been very good about this, an audit of where we stand with respect to the utilization of Pell Grant money, with respect to the relationship between banks and loans, the ability of young people to finance their education in the District of Columbia, and the status of what community colleges can do in a place like this. Yes, we are entering a knowledge-based economy. And this is so serious that it ought to be a mantra in every African-American family. When I grew up, you could take your girl to the movies by picking up 10 cans off the street. You can't do that anymore. The nature of the rise of the scale of economy that it takes to live out a viable existence in the country ought to be, I think, information one for every family. We don't deal enough with literacy, economic literacy education. I know that 100 black men, they do a lot of that. Literacy education for young people. But we ought to give them a sense of what it takes to have a viable existence. And when we talk about that, it'll be clear that one of the things increasingly it's going to take is some form of education, not like it used to be. And the reason, of course, is that when we look at the decline, as Representative Norton said, in industrial jobs, if these jobs are declining, the question is, what is remaining? And what remains are those jobs that it takes education and training to get. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I have here a sheet from the Department of Labor. And what it lists are the fastest growing occupations, 2008 projected to 2018. I'll read them off right quick. Biomedical engineers, network systems and data communication analysts, home health aides, personal and home care aides, financial examiners, medical scientists, physician's assistants, skincare specialists, biochemists and biophysicists, athletic trainers, physical therapist aides, dental hygienists. You can see most of these are in the field of health, all right? self-enrichment education teachers, compliance officers, occupational therapists, environmental engineers, pharmacy technicians, computer software engineers, survey researchers, physical therapists, personal financial advisors, environmental engineer technicians, occupational therapists and assistants. Okay, when you look at this list, what I did was I went back because they did something very interesting. They put on the side of each one of these categories the amount of education that it would take to get that job. And so there's a little back of the envelope figuring, when you look at all of these jobs that it takes to get a doctorate, a master's, a BA, an associate degree, a professional degree, constitutes 68% of the future jobs. 68% of the future jobs. For those that required some on-the-job training, 27%. So that whole scale of what you could do when you're a young kid picking up the cans is sinking slowly into the West. And what's emerging is that 68, 70% that it takes to get a decent job to have a family these days. Now, the new level of skills are needed. Some of those, I think, will come not just from university colleges, but from the community colleges. And the president the other day talked about that. He says we put $12 billion in the community colleges through TARP because we wanted to marry that opportunity to the green jobs. Make that available. Just recently, $2 billion more into community colleges. And community colleges are beginning, I think, to be very important because that's where most of our kids are. That's where most African-American kids are. So we need to look at them not as just as incubators for the workplace, but as places where we begin to round out some other things. For example, there ought to be, as there is in Bronx Community College, a black male program. A black male program. There ought to be, as there is in Medgar Evers College, a black leadership program at the community college level. And so there ought to be, it seems to me, in Washington, D.C., where we're creating a community college, something like that, which points people in a direction with some soft skills, yes, but also with other kinds of skills that make them whole people. We don't necessarily need, everybody needs a doctorate, a master's, and a BA. I served, as I close, a couple of years ago as a member of the Dellums Commission on the black male that was put together by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. We had a very interesting time looking at educational reform. And I think that as you think about this, think about educational reform. The civil rights community has just come out with a 17-page blueprint on educational reform that challenges some aspect of the president's program. We ought to look at that very carefully because the race to the top is structured in a way which privileges to some extent elite institutions, elite methodologies, and raises questions about whether or not the people who really need the monies that have been put out there are actually going to get it. So we need to think about education reform as we did in the Dellums Commission even then. For the future, we've got a going on about the economic deficit. We need as a community to think about and cause others to think about what happens when you have a whole generation of unemployable black males. I haven't even talked about incarceration rates and recidivism and that whole ball of wax that I know we want to get into. But in that sector and in others, if we don't deal seriously with this, we're building the bedrock for a generation of unemployable people who are not going to be able to take advantage of this knowledge economy. To me, that is the social deficit we need to be talking about. Nobody talks about the social deficit. That is more important and more powerful than the economic deficit. And the final point I will make is that jobs exist in communities. And one of the things that we have turned our back on the last 30 years, because of the advent of the conservative movement, is urban policy. Urban policy. The White House has put together a White House office on urban affairs. I would hope that at some point we begin to have a serious discussion about the context for employment, for jobs, for education, because we sometimes approach these problems as though you could excerpt one sector out of the community and deal with it successfully. If a city like Washington, D.C., where areas of the city are experiencing intractable poverty, it's going to be very difficult to lift one institution out of that situation and deal with it successfully. So I leave you with that. We need to deal with urban policy in a very serious way. I better shut up. Okay.
Move this over. First of all, thank you again for having me, and thank the Congresswoman for the. Yes, my name is Mike Jones. I'm a partner at Kirkland and Ellis, one of the largest law firms in the country. I practice here in D.C. and across the country, and I live in D.C. When I was at Georgetown Law School, I was actually a research assistant for Congresswoman Norton long before she was interested in getting involved in politics. My wife and I, some years ago, set up a tutoring program in connection with the NAACP, where my wife and I paid teachers, retired teachers, to provide tutoring services in the summer for poor African American students. We endowed scholarships at Dillard University in New Orleans for underprivileged students, and we've done something similar at Georgetown for African American students looking to go to Georgetown. I've been very active in the mentoring programs here in D.C. through Mentors Inc. and other similar organizations. Before his death, some years ago, in connection with a case that he and I were working together on, Johnny Cochran came into my office, looked out the window at the White House and said, "Homeboy, this is a long way from Shreveport." I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is the same place that Johnny Cochran did. And he's written a book called The Journey to Justice, and I guess if I were to write one, it would be called The Journey from the Cotton Fields of Shreveport. Some years ago, I was on a panel at Howard University, the political science department, and one student asked me, how did I feel being, at that time, one of the few African Americans at a large, to use his phrase, a large white law firm. When I joined the firm in 1986, they had in its history never had an African American partner, and I think in the whole of the firm there might have been two other African Americans. My response was that it felt a whole lot better than my first jobs, which was being an African American in the cotton fields and my uncle and my grandparents' farms, where we, as was tradition, would start at 7 o'clock in the hot morning and end when the hot sun went down. I think that the journey starts with that job, but importantly includes a number of other jobs, and I think that, unfortunately, some of those opportunities are not available now. My next series of jobs was working through, you may not even remember that there was such a thing, but it was called the CETA, Comprehensive Employment Training Act program. And those first series of jobs were, and I have to tell you that in a way, the bravest thing that I could have ever done. I had no anxiety appearing in front of juries from New York to Hawaii. I have no anxieties appearing in front of judges, no matter what their reputation is. The greatest thing I think that I have ever overcome was in those first jobs. I was a high school leader, student council president, very well thought of. And those first jobs were essentially working with the janitorial staff. And it took me some time to get my mind wrapped around the idea of students seeing me after having led a meeting, mopping and sweeping the floor with the janitors. When I overcame that, I never had an anxious moment, thereafter. Those jobs taught me a lot of things. First of all, I would spend a lot of time talking, with the janitors, and not only did I earn a paycheck, which I absolutely needed to have. I was one of 7 children. My father had a 3rd grade education. I was a construction worker who became disabled very early on. So as a practical matter, my mother had her own series of health issues. So as a practical matter, we had to work. And working was a way, not for me really to get goodies or luxuries, but life's necessities. I was hit hard by the death of Michael Jackson because he was the first guy that I ever was aware of to, in my mind, and growing up in Louisiana, one, to transcend race, and then secondly, and probably more importantly, he provided me the incentive to stay out there in that hot sun, picking cotton, because I had seen him on Soul Train, and I'd seen those two-tone bell-bottom pants that he had on, and I know you can buy those 2 pair for $5 at the Globe and Woolworth in those days. So even though we would, after 2 hot days working down there, we would earn $5 in those days, that was enough to get us, those two-tone pants. So those jobs really gave me to appreciate the value of work. And I'll tell you that in terms of the employment, I moved on from there again through the CEDAR program. I started out with these janitorial jobs. Then I was able to get some office jobs working at urban development before I went off to college. Those, the work ethic, the kinds of attitudes that I learned, and to appreciate everybody as a part of the team. So, for example, think about my law firm. Consider that the folks who work in the mailroom, the legal assistants, the secretaries, the people who increasingly are Hispanic who come in to empty the trash in the evenings, I see them as an important part of the team, and that helps me when I have to stand in front of juries in various places in the country. The other thing that I would say that has helped in that journey is Dr. Walters talked about it in general education. I want to talk about it in somewhat more specific. People who went to middle school, high school, law school with me would probably say, yeah, Mike Jones, that's that really smart guy. The first 4 years of my education, that is not how people describe me. The first 4 years of my education, in fact, I was just looking at the letter last night. In 1968, my parents got a letter from the Caddo Parish School Board informing them that as of 1968, Negro students could now go to any school that they wanted to go to. So as a result of that, I transitioned in the middle of my 4th grade year from a probably African-American school to what had been a white institution. 5th grade year, I think I was reading at a level that was considered a year behind. But by the time I was in the 6th grade year, I ran across a teacher who interjected the idea of competition into the classroom, which is to say that you have to do a certain amount of work, and then you took a test and you go on to the next level. Well, I was intrigued by the attention that was being paid to 2 boys in the class, 2 white boys, David and Rusty, who were at the top of the heap, so to speak, in terms of reading. And so I vowed that, I was very competitive. I ran track. In fact, it was won a city meet the last time I competed. So I like the idea of trying to catch these guys. I like the idea of taking athletic competition over into the academic arena, and I am happy to say that I did catch those guys. But by the time I got to the middle school, I was again in gone to all black school, and then I think I met and had exposure to the most profound teacher, most profound mentoring experience that I was to have, a African American man who was an English teacher. And you talk about making education fun. He was the first one that I'm ever aware of to have a quiz bowl competition, and we had playing in the background Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. And it was cool to be smart. It was cool to get the A's, and that was one of the greatest educational experiences that I ever had in that middle school. So when I look at what I do now and what I try to help other African American men in particular with, I drove back and to say to them, look, whatever kinds of job employment experiences that you have, even if it is not where you ultimately want to be, you absolutely need to make the best of it because there's something to be learned from every level of employment. When we look at people in my law firm, from the lawyers to the legal assistants, and George, you may be able to identify with this as an athlete, I say to people that, so much of it is attitude. So much of it is having the hunger, because I have to tell you that on my teams, somebody who is hungry, somebody who is really, wanting to roll their sleeves up and help to win one for the team, even if they are not, quote, the smartest, even if they don't have the best credentials in compared to others, that's the person that I'm going to be rooting for. And I say this to folks that I mentor too. I said that one of the things, I will tell you, it's lucky for, when I see some young people out, and I see it more often than not at supermarkets that you shop at, where sometimes it seems like when the customer comes up, rather than encountering somebody who's doing their job, they're interrupting people who are having this grand conversation about the things that they had done. So if you have in that situation an opportunity to advance some employees, I think the people who are going to get ahead are the people, even if the skill levels are comparable, the people who come to it with a go-getter attitude and to put the customer, putting the team first. I'm happy to answer, other specific questions, but I just kind of wanted to lay out to you, my background, and for those who believe in, in a higher being, and probably considered a miracle. For those who don't, a freak of nature. But I think that the truth is that there's a formula, just like in sports, there's a winning formula: hard work, education, and treating education the way you would sports. Getting in, practicing. When I tell my kids this, they actually laugh that I, believe it or not, when I was in college, I had a chance to study abroad for a year because of the scholarship that I won. And I thought that one of the areas that I was weak on was my vocabulary wasn't quite as broad as I would like it to be. So what did I do? I didn't lay my head on a book and hope through osmosis that it would get in there. I studied the dictionary. And sure enough, before long, that was not a problem for me anymore. So again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to answering specific questions.
Rodney, introduce yourself. Without giving one introduction.
Good evening. My name is Rodney Mitchell. I'm just so honored to be here in my hometown, and I'm honored to be asked by Congressman Holmes to come here to testify on an issue that is near and dear to my heart. As it was stated, I'm a homeboy. grew up in Southeast D.C., and, I consider myself a survivor of the 80s, a survivor of one of the periods in our history that was so devastating that when I came back from school in the late 1990s, half of my class were gone. 7 of the varsity basketball players on the H.D. Woodson varsity team were dead from violent crime on the streets. So when I heard the call to come here to talk about what black men need to do in the toughest job market in history, I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the population that I come from and the challenges that we face as people would call ex-offenders or returning citizens. As I stated, as a survivor of the 1980s, I don't have to give you the gory details, but I was never criminally minded, but there were dynamics and circumstances in Washington, D.C. and South Central that led a lot of young African-American males to enter into an illicit market that had to do with the sales and distribution of crack cocaine. There was subsequently a policy called the War on Drugs that systematically ravaged our neighborhoods in a way that hyper-incarcerated, hyper-arrested African-American males in record numbers. I witnessed this both in Washington, D.C., and the ghettos of D.C., Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, Southwest, as well as all throughout South Central Los Angeles. I can attest to the fact that in many cases, while not making excuses, a lot of these so-called drug dealers, I won't say forced into this market, but were compelled to take part in this market as a means to an end. For some, it was glamorous and they romanticized the whole idea of being a drug dealer. For others, it was day-to-day survival. But that's a mixed bag of people who all ended up in a federal penitentiary or a state penitentiary. I don't know of one so-called baller from that period who was alive or who has invested those dollars and is now living, a so-called normal life. Most of those gentlemen, men and women, are dead or doing life in prison. I want to use part of my story to talk about the charge of what black men need to do in the toughest job market. As I stated, I'm practicing law now, so I want to be careful about how I talk about my background, because there were people who thought it well enough of me to allow me to practice law after all that. So while I'll tell you that I am very much rehabilitated after 19 years, and I am certainly very remorseful and very dedicated and committed to living a civil and law-abiding lifestyle, that lifestyle continues to this day to, not, I won't say haunt, but I must deal with it. It is the records of my past that every person with a criminal history must deal with at some level. So, I'll start at the point of redemption and rehabilitation. 1992, I was paroled from a California correction facility, and I immediately knew, well, let's back up. Before I was paroled, I had already started rehabilitating and knew that, number one, my brief exposure to college by attending the Maryland University basketball camp for that one summer in the 9th grade inspired me that I knew I wanted to do college, if no more just to go to the student union and hang out with the girls. So I knew that education was part of my road or my path, and particularly higher education. Now, having said that, I had extensive work history as a teenager. I worked every summer, whether it was through one of Marion Barry's jobs or a job that I found myself. I worked at Art Young's Menswear on 8th Street, and I used to hem the pants for all the pimps that came through there. Okay, you guys remember Art Young's. So I always kept a job. So I knew that work and school was part of my plan to rehabilitate myself. I wasn't depending on a lot of state programs and county programs because at the time there were none. Reentry, the word wasn't even known at that time. So fast forward the tape. So I'm home, 1992, I'm in a halfway house, and I'm looking for work. And like many other so-called ex-offenders, we look to the industries that will more readily take us. So driving is one of the jobs that we do. Everybody gets a CDL license when you come home from prison. And I did as well. Here's the catch. So I passed the CDL license with flying colors. I went down to Temple Street in Los Angeles to get my credential to drive the dash bus. And I was stopped dead in my tracks because Rodney Mitchell was a felon. I had spent about a good 8 weeks in that program. And I'll forget, I walked to my sister's house, sat on her couch, and cried real tears. I hadn't cried in about 20 years because I knew what was facing me if I didn't work. And I was determined I wasn't going back to anyone's institutions. My older sister took me to another place called Women at Work. And I was like, damn, I'm not going in there. I'm looking for a job. Women at Work, I can't do it. She said, come on in. My older sister's like my mom, if you understand what I'm saying. And I found a janitorial job at night. And I got that job by misrepresenting my criminal history because I had just lost one job. So it was either call a white lie about my criminal history or potentially face the streets again. I got that job. And the other part